Cloud. Great, there we go. All right, so reintroduction. I'm Christian McClung from Emergency Physicians here at Palomar, and we're doing a talk on targeted temperature management. The purpose of this is to share both a passion I have for studying how to do neuroprotection and neuropreservation in the setting of anoxic brain injury, and just stems from my prior experiences of doing research and molecular studies of how cells respond to a lack of oxygen, and combining that with non-invasive hemodynamic monitors that measure cardiac output and predict flow. And we use this in a number of settings, both in the clinical settings and in laboratory settings, where we put devices on limbs and on chests to measure the cardiac output during CPR, as well as to measure the blood flow during CPR. And some of that led to doing research looking at putting devices on the eye to measure the retinal blood flow during CPR, because the retina is really brain, and it's the external portion of your brain that you could get measurements from. And so that research really just led to this idea of trying to put forth an approach to resuscitation where you would use targeted physiologic data in real time, right? So right now our targeted physiologic data for 99% of places where you do CPR is, did you get a pulse back or not? And can you feel the pulse, and was there a deep enough chest compression or not? And that's been changing recently, where we're using end-tidal CO2 as a measure of perfusion. But even that in and of itself has a number of limitations. And so this idea of coming around and looking at multiple metrics at the same time is really where things will eventually get to. It's just a matter of having the technology and the resources dispersed to the EMS units and within hospitals to really have that natural feedback and being able to see what is the blood flow to the brain while you're doing CPR, because that's really what you want to know. And you'd like to know the coronary artery perfusion pressures, because that's an important physiologic measurement of getting return of circulation. I'm mentioning all of that aspect, even though we're going to talk about temperature management, which is often a post-resuscitation management, because the context of that's really important. The quality of CPR matters first. The shorter the duration between cardiac arrest and return of circulation has the best prediction and beneficial aspect of normal neurologic recovery. And so that has to always be the mainstay of in the context that we're working in, is that we have to be doing things that return circulation as quickly as possible. That means early defibrillation. It means low fraction off the chest, so your continuous chest compression time should be a really high fraction, right? The quality of the chest compression should be good. For those of you that have done CPR with me in the room, you'll see that I do things differently and do interposed abdominal compression CPR, which in many places gets me sideways glances because people see me pressing on the stomach and they think it looks weird. But the perfusion pressures are always higher with that. And that's, again, what we're trying to do, is we're trying to improve our perfusion pressures. And so those mechanical processes are important. And it's worth mentioning as well, as we begin seeing more and more pre-hospital units using mechanical devices, that we have to recognize that those mechanical devices in and of themselves have limitations too. They keep pushing on the same part of the chest over and over and over again, which is what you're supposed to do, right? However, when you do that, the chest wall deforms eventually. And the lack of changing position doesn't adequately address that chest wall deformity in the subtle changes that you make when you're hands-on CPR. When you're hands-on CPR, you have a feedback where you can feel the change in the elasticity and recoil of the chest. And if you're an experienced chest compressor, you know to move your hands and to kind of find a feel that feels a stronger recoil effect. There's that ability that we have to do that, where these devices don't. They don't give you the feedback about that. They may give you feedback about chest depth compression, and if you're being keen during the arrest, you may be paying attention to that metric seeing that metric change and realizing like, oh, my average chest compression depth has changed. And that's a reflection that the chest isn't recoiling as much, so the depth is getting more narrow. But unless that's something you're looking for, which most clinicians aren't, you're not going to be paying attention to it. And so you'll feel a pulse with the chest compression from the device and then assume that that must be the very best pulse that you can get from that resuscitation. And it isn't. You can get a better you can get a stronger pulse and a better force by doing abdominal compression with the device on, which used to not be feasible because you needed 3 people to do CPR in the rig, and that just wasn't feasible to do that. To have somebody manage airway, someone do chest compressions, someone do abdominal compressions. But now that you're using these devices, you could just start doing abdominal compressions interposed between them and improve the perfusion. And that's a really important part to try to get as a lesson to EMS, is that as we transition to these automated devices, it doesn't mean that you should take that your hands are completely off that patient. You now have an opportunity to use your hands in a new way to improve care. And the faster you do that, the better you do that, the better we have an opportunity for consideration of targeted temperature management. So I'm sorry about being long-winded about that part, but I just want to make sure that we're starting this conversation off with a context that's appropriate, and I'm not just running into targeted temperature management and looking at this as a larger effect than we should expect it to be. Any questions about that or concerns? All right. So the objectives are, we're going to do a pretty comprehensive literature review of the evidence for therapeutic hypothermia, protocols for implementing this, looking at the Arctic Sun use and management, and also about how to manage shivering and why that would be important. As a disclosure, I don't have any financial relationship to any company involved in this type of treatment or protocols or anything of that nature. The only conflict of interest I have is in EKG monitoring, and that's unrelated to this. So let's start off with a study that was just recently published. In fact, it's in its pre-proof stage in the Journal of Resuscitation, looking at cold fluids for the induction of targeted temperature management. And this is a sub-study of a larger trial that was performed. And in this study, the authors looked to see, does giving cold fluids early on in the post-resuscitation phase improve survival? Does it improve outcomes? And the reason that this comes about and this question is there is that going back to 2002, Stephen Bernard, who did studies in Australia, put cold IV fluids into patients in the pre-hospital setting. So, and that story is an interesting story. I've met Dr. Bernard and had dinner with him at a meeting once and talked to him at length about his trials and kind of like some of the inner aspects of like how do you run a trial and what were the things that were challenging when you were doing your trial. And one of the interesting stories was that when he was doing his trial, they were trying to use a refrigerator unit to keep the saline cold, and they wanted the saline to be really cold, almost ice cold, as it was being infused into patients during cardiac arrest. And overall, his study found that there was a benefit in cooling patients, and that there was that therapeutic hypothermia begun early on in a cardiac arrest led to improved neurologic outcomes. And that was the big finding in his study, and it had a profound impact. Today now there are journals called Therapeutic Hypothermia Journal, and there are hundreds and thousands of articles devoted to this subject matter. This is a really well-studied subject matter that still requires additional study, but in a short period of time has been studied well because of pioneers like Dr. Bernard and a myriad of others. But one of the interesting stories was that when they were trying to put the refrigeration unit and use that in the ambulances, it depletes the battery. And if you can't start the ambulance, guess what doesn't matter? It's having cold fluids on the ambulance, right? Like, if you can't get to the patient, nobody cares. And so it was solved by the simple issue of purchasing igloos and those portable cooling boxes, and then putting it in there, and then traveling with them around like that. You lose a little bit of the nuance of being able to say, well, we knew that the fluids were all at this temperature when we were infusing them, because, in an igloo things can warm up a little bit, and so there was that aspect of it. So anyway, so this is where that idea has been around for quite a while now. And so during this trial, the authors took out a sub-study to look at, was giving cold fluids helpful for induction and getting you to the targeted temperature that you wanted to be at. And basically what they found was in their study that initiating the targeted temperature management before ICU arrival by using cold fluids wasn't associated with a decrease in the time to reach a targeted temperature. And this was a targeted temperature of less than, basically 33 degrees Celsius. And furthermore, the patients who received cold fluids had slightly higher temperatures during the first 24 hours as compared with those who did not receive cold fluids. And they did not find any association between cold fluid use and electrolyte abnormalities, circulatory adverse effects, or outcomes. And without getting into too much with this article, some of the reasons why early cold fluids may have a problem with temperature management may be due to shivering, and that patients that begin to shiver early may have higher metabolic activity and therefore may be harder to cool in that time frame to reach that target that you're trying to get to. And so that's one part of it. It's important to just start off with that and identify, like, where do we have limitations in science, and this is one of them. Another study that was done is done by a group of researchers that are enthusiastic about therapeutic hypothermia, and it's really important to note that they're in any form of science, you have a group of enthusiasts and you have a group of skeptics, and both have good rationales for why they want to be on that side of the fence that they're on, and both of them feel passionate about why they should be on the side of the fence that they're on. And so I think the great thing about science is it gives an opportunity to study both perspectives, and at the same time, there's a natural bias in your approach and your writing based on that as well. If you're getting funding for therapeutic hypothermia and you're enthusiastic about its results, your bias is to see improvements, right? So no matter how objective your studies are, the nice thing about having a description of a trial before you conduct it is it keeps you honest for what your primary outcomes are going to be. And so you're going to measure those primary outcomes in a faithful way. However, you are still left to interpret the other portions of your trial that are more subjective. And so our biases, whether we expect them or not, come out in the way that we discuss them and discuss our study results. And so it's just worth mentioning this is a group of authors that are very enthusiastic about hypothermia, and they give a good rationale for it. So this figure here is a common thing that occurs across scientific journals, but also at conferences as well, where there is a complex biological model that's put in front of you. And the researcher comes to you and says, well, look at all of these very complex interactions that are occurring, and each one of these has been demonstrated to be associated with an outcome of cardiac arrest. The amount of mitochondrial damage, the amount of free radicals, the amount of membrane degradation, the amount of inflammatory mediators have all been demonstrated independently in different studies to be associated with good neurologic outcome or poor neurologic outcome, depending upon what the balance is there. And the authors are using this figure to show you, well, when you provide therapeutic hypothermia to somebody, you're mitigating all of these factors. You're decreasing the amount of mitochondrial damage, you're decreasing the amount of free radicals, you're decreasing the inflammatory mediators, and you're even improving the balance between glutamate and potassium migration through the cell, and preserving cell membrane as well through this. And more importantly, preserving the cellular reactivity to electrical activity. So that's what this complex figure shows. And it's all well and good to show a biological model that's plausible, because that's an important part of science. But I will tell you, in my experience, this is overemphasized in that this thus therefore leads to improved clinical experience. Over and over and over again, I've seen from really, really well-respected basic science researchers that the models that are seen in the lab must translate to clinical and bedside outcomes. And this is where the philosophy of having translational research came from, where we needed to have better bedside to bench agreement. What we experience often is that the laboratory gives us one experience and it doesn't translate at the bedside. And so the authors in this article start off with this very robust biological model and say therapeutic hypothermia is going to help with all of this. They then show clinical studies where therapeutic hypothermia is compared to normothermia. So basically, patients go into cardiac arrest. One of the things that happens to everybody who goes into cardiac arrest is that you go into heart failure. And as a result of poor contractility of the heart and the failure of that, your body temperature drops, right? Like when you're running, you get warm, you sweat. Right? Body temperature has to be mitigated by your brain. Your brain has to figure out a way, like, how do I keep a normal body temperature and don't let you warm up too much, right? So you sweat and evaporate to maintain those body temperatures. Your brain is doing a number of complex things to help keep that temperature normal, and it's using various different aspects of your vessels by vasodilating and doing a whole bunch of different things to help manage temperature. But when you starve a brain of oxygen, it starts to lose the ability for thermoregulation. And that is a complex problem, because not only do you now lose your thermostat to some degree, you've also lost some of the pump and the ability for the vessels to respond to provide all of that. And so your temperature naturally drops in following cardiac arrest, even once you get a pulse back. And then over time, there's an inflammatory cascade that occurs because you've been starved of a certain substrate that was necessary. And those cells have swollen, they've become inflamed. There's this secondary rush of inflammatory markers and events that occur, and your body temperature rises, and you can become hyperthermic and have fever. We know that having a fever following this type of event is further detrimental to your neuroprotection. Your brain does not do well with fever following a cardiac arrest. And so it's important to avoid that, and that's been well studied in a whole bunch of different models, in traumatic brain injury, in stroke, seizure. I mean, I can go on with the different types of ways of injuring a brain, but brain injury and pyrexia are bad and need to be avoided. The hypothermia aspect here, though, is you realize that hypothermia lasts for more or less about 4 hours or so in that patient group. And after about the 4 to 5 hour mark, then the body temperature begins to increase, and you begin seeing that difference. Certainly by 8 hours, they're back at normal temperature, and then And then from there, the temperature can increase, and then you can see a group that are having fevers and those that aren't. In the hypothermia group, it's hard to get somebody from this phase down to this phase. It takes active cooling to get somebody there because you've lost some of that thermostat, and that ability to adjust and change your temperature is affected, so it requires an active measure to do that. And so here you can see in one of the trials that it took a while to get somebody down to targeted temperature, and it took more than 8 hours to get them down to that temperature. This is important to consider because there's a lot of researchers who are enthusiastic who will say to you, the time that it took to get down to therapeutic temperature was a time of persistent neurologic injury. That until you could cool things, things were still going off. And you can think of that as in terms of like a picnic. You can be out, you can be making sandwiches, and you put your sandwiches in the cooler. And let's say it's egg salad. That's the one that gets most people sick, right?
Tuna fish.
Yeah, the tuna fish, but the egg salads in particular, right? That's when you look at the epidemiologic outbreaks of salmonella and other problems where you see a bunch of people that die from salmonella. It's usually the grandparents, and it's usually egg salad. And so you make your egg salad sandwich and you put it in the cooler. Well, that mixture of eggs and mayonnaise and everything else like that is still allowing bacterial growth for a while until it reaches temperature, right? So it's still spoiling in the cooler until it reaches a temperature when it's inhibiting bacterial growth. So your brain is still spoiling until you reach a temperature that is neuroprotective, and that's the biological model that is proposed to everybody. And so if you're enthusiastic about that, your idea is, well, what can we do to make that temperature target as quick as possible? And the faster I can do that, the faster my neuroprotection is, the more cells that should be viable, and the better the neurologic outcome should be for that reason. This next graph over here shows another group that were both receiving therapeutic hypothermia, and this was a group that was comparing 33 degrees to 36 degrees cooling. So remember, normal body temperature is around 37 degrees Celsius, so 36 is cooler, it's a mild hypothermia, and 33 degrees is cooler, which is also mild hypothermia. It's just obviously 3 degrees difference in Celsius. The reason we use these mild terms of hypothermia is to differentiate them from the type of hypothermia that is moderate or more controlled in neurosurgical procedures, where you will bring somebody's body temperature down to, in some instances, down to 15 degrees Celsius. And in others, even 10 degrees. I think 10 degrees Celsius is the most extreme I've seen in any human study. And so that approach and this is where we got a lot of our theories from, of like cooling the brain helps us preserve it for even in the setting of injury such as surgery. So again, these are mild hypothermias that we're inducing. Nonetheless, in this group, they showed that they were really trying to bring their target temperature down. And it was easy to do in the 36-degree group because you already kind of start off around that. And so it wasn't that hard to keep somebody at 36 degrees, whereas getting down to 33 degrees still took about 8 hours, 7 hours or so to get there. So this inertia of getting from your immediate raw temperature down to therapeutic temperature is viewed by the enthusiasts as an opportunity to improve care. And there may be a number of issues that are associated with that. And we're going to hopefully discuss most of them. The authors here also show you what happens to different types of neurologic cells. And it's important to understand this because neurons, this is the blue line, when they're starved of oxygen, their viability drops the most rapidly. And that's then followed by endothelial cells that are supporting neurons with blood flow, right? And those are similarly falling, but not quite at the same rate, but close, and they kind of mirror each other. There's just a slight delay in endothelial cell viability changes. And compared to astrocytes, which are a supportive cell, right? That's almost an infrastructural cell for support for the neurons. So all of these all three cell types are important because it's an organ. So it's not just one cell type that's present. So as a brain organ, these are the differential rates that cells die over time. And within 2 hours, you only have 20% of cells that are viable as neurons. But you have about 50% that are viable as endothelial cells, and you have about 60% that are viable as astrocytes. So it's kind of an example of that 2 hour window, I think, is worth noting. And the 1 hour window is important for neurons because within 1 hour, you're just over 50% that are viable. So you can see that when you're trying to preserve neurons and you're trying to keep things at this level here, it takes a great deal of effort and planning ahead of time of all the aspects of resuscitation. Right? And cooling, again, is just one part of that, but those chest compressions and everything that we're doing before that matter tremendously. The authors then also look at chemical responses to go along that correlates with this. So LDH is a enzyme that's intracellular, and when the cell breaks, it releases. And so you can see similarly by 2 hours, there's a lot of LDH coming out of neurons because they're dying, and less so from the endothelial cells and less so from the astrocytes. So what's worth noting is that in a separate study, they looked at two cell lines. They looked at neurons, that's A and B here. So it's going to be one row here is neurons. And down in this row, C and D, are astrocytes. So they first basically just did a control of not injuring the cells whatsoever, and you have both groups having the same amount of viability, but at 100% viability. You haven't injured anything, so they should stay the same, right? Then those groups are now subjected to injury, and they're starved of oxygen for the same length of time, so on and so forth. So now, without doing anything to the cells, just letting nature take its course. Nature's course is that 20% of the cells are going to be viable. That's what you're going to end up with if you're letting nature just take its course. If, on the other hand, within 2 hours, you're providing hypothermia at 33 degrees versus 35 degrees. So the dark black is going to be 33 degrees Celsius as a target. The white bars are going to be 35 degrees Celsius. And you can see there's an improvement in viability of the neurons at the 2 hour mark with 33 degrees in comparison to 35. And both of these are significantly better than letting nature take its course. At 6 hours of hypothermia, again, you have a preserved amount of neurons in both groups, but the 33 degrees is better than 35 degrees. Same thing is seen here at the 24-hour mark. And again, you can see that the therapeutic hypothermia over a prolonged period of time seems to increase the amount of surviving neurons. So there's a therapeutic benefit of hypothermia, and its neuroprotection is quite evident in comparison to letting nature take its course. This is when there was no delay in providing the hypothermia. Now, if you delayed 90 minutes, these results drop dramatically. And so now the amount of neurons that are being preserved still favors 33 degrees over 35 degrees, right? And each time point, 33 is better than 35. But in comparison to the delayed hypothermia, there's a significant drop-off. So the authors of this article, again, they're enthusiasts, are suggesting you really should not delay your hypothermia response because there is a lack of neuroprotection when you delay. And this is a delay of 90 minutes, which is not an uncommon amount of delay from the period of time that your cardiac arrest began and your hypothermia treatment began, right? Somebody goes down in the field. If it's witnessed, EMS is notified, and average response times are really probably closer to 10 minutes than they are to 6 minutes. Everybody likes to publish 6 minutes, but in reality, it's probably closer to 10 minutes, but it's still fast in an urban environment. Then you're on scene for probably 20 minutes. Transport to the ER, if you're still in cardiac arrest, another 20 minutes to 30 minutes for most patients, most ERs in the country. So you're already at 50 minutes plus 5 for the, or 50 plus 10. So you're at an hour at the mark that you've gotten return of circulation. And now you don't know what the cause of the arrest was, and you may be concerned about was there a head bleed or not here, so then you get a head CT. And if you can get the head CT done and read within 30 minutes, right? So then you're at the night, right? So then you're at, like, it's not uncommon to be at the 90-minute mark and realize that you may be irreversibly losing neurons during that entire time frame. And so it's easy to be really nihilistic about this because I used to tell people when I was doing research in resuscitation that my daughter could predict resuscitation really well, and she was like 2 years old at the time, and 2-year-olds know how to say no. All right, so I could just go like, "Do you think they're going to survive, darling?" And she'd be like, "No, Daddy," right? And I'd be like, "My kid's brilliant. Like, she gets us right like 90% of the time, right? Because 90% of the time that patient's not going to survive. She's a genius, right?" And so it's easy to be nihilistic about it because this is a difficult clinical problem to have. Patients don't do well when you starve them of oxygen. You starve the heart and brain of oxygen. They just don't do well. And there's a lot of researchers out there that who are really good researchers, who refuse to do research in this area because they think that we're all a bunch of people that are on a quest charging the windmills in a quixotic way that we think we're going to change the outcome for something that is already almost predetermined. And it's one of the things I like about people in resuscitation is that we're all optimists, right? The most cynical person in the room who's doing chest compressions is still an optimist in the fact that they're in the room doing that, right? And so it's important to at least recognize what does the science show us from a basic science standpoint, right? And this is basic science. This is not necessarily showing us what happens to patients that are like this. This is just looking at cells and viability in the culture setting. And the same thing can be seen here with the astrocytes. When there's no delay, there's significant improvement in 33 degrees versus 35 degrees. And you see that the astrocytes in particular have the most benefit in comparison, right? 33 to 35 degrees may not make as huge of a difference for neurons, but it makes a huge difference for astrocytes. And again, we're resuscitating an organ. We're not resuscitating just the neurons. So the neurons are obviously important. If you don't have neurons, you're not sending messages, you're not, right? But if you don't have the supporting structures for those neurons, you're not doing well either, right? No matter how nice a kitchen is, it doesn't matter if there's no ingredients in it. So this is, the astrocytes are an important substrate for protection. And again, their viability is also affected by delays. A little bit less so in comparison to neurons, but it still is diminished in comparison across the line here. So at 33 degrees in 24 hours, the astrocytes have less viability than they do if there's no delay in applying therapeutic hypothermia. So the authors then said, okay, well, we've shown you a biological plausibility. Let's show you what the research shows in clinical trials of patients. And so here is the TTM trial, and this was comparing 36 degrees versus 33 degrees, and they found that there was really, it was 48% at 36 degrees that had good neurologic outcome and 46% that had good neurologic outcome at 33 degrees. this single trial had a huge impact where this was published in New England Journal of Medicine, which is a very respected journal, and a lot of people seeing this began to be dissuaded towards doing therapeutic hypothermia or doing a aggressive therapeutic hypothermia protocol, because they said, well, if 33 degrees, which is so much harder to get somebody to, it takes hours and hours to get them there, isn't any better than 36, why are we all bothering doing this? Let's just keep them at 36, and we'll do some things to keep them cool, but that'll be that. And that has been the overwhelming effect of that trial. And it was a good trial. There are some aspects to that trial that are like any trial are significant limitations, but that trial probably had the greatest impact on how we've been approaching this since. And so there are a number of articles coming out since this trial showing that there's been a laxed attitude about therapeutic temperature management since. The trial that preceded this was the HACA trial. It was getting patients, basically trying to get them 33 degrees, so keeping them at or below 34 degrees, but no cooler than 32 degrees, versus letting nature take its course with normothermia. And you had a significant improvement in neurologic outcome. 55% of the patients survived with good neurologic outcome versus 40% that didn't. Not really hard to figure out which part of that arm you want your family member in, right? And then the studies with Dr. Bernard and colleagues out of Melbourne looked at 33 degrees versus normo, and also significant differences here, 48% survival versus 26% survival, right? So in two studies, it was really quite obvious when you're comparing cooling somebody actively versus not managing their temperature, that there's a significant difference in outcome. In a study already assuming that therapeutic hypothermia is beneficial, making them cooler didn't seem to demonstrate a significant difference in outcomes. And these authors would point out that because of their enthusiasm, that what was happening here was that there wasn't enough attention to getting to this faster, and that you weren't getting the targeted temperature faster, and so you weren't really comparing each other. And then more importantly, what they suggest from a scientific standpoint is that in order to show a difference between this group and this group, you need a much larger study trial than you do for these two previous studies. So there may be a significant difference between these, but they just didn't recruit enough patients to show it. That's the idea behind the enthusiasts. The skeptics would have a completely different approach to that and say it's not worth spending all this money to do this because 36 degrees is just as good as everything else. And the problem with that is looking back at this data and realizing that there are differences between how cells respond to this. And if there is a biological plausibility to this, we should be resuscitating to an idea of what preserves cells, and not just simply ignoring that because other data says, well, that's not important. We know that temperature management is important for cell preservation, because I don't think that there's a lot of dispute about that. I think the issue is, how do we achieve that? How do we do it? And what are the other things that we do as an organization to improve our resuscitations? Because how the emergency department works with EMS is absolutely critical. And how that department works with intensive care, just as critical, as well as how well the cardiologists play a role in that. So this multimodal, multidisciplinary approach of how medics, nurses, physicians, cardiology teams, and intensive care teams all matters. And so this is one of the reasons why we're recording this, is to share that with our colleagues across the institution. So this was important enough to pull out, where they just really felt the most critical issue facing their patients is the spreading nihilism amongst clinicians who have not examined all the available data carefully. And a single experiment should never move a field dramatically, really in either direction. Yet it's exactly what's happened following that temperature, that TTM study. And the totality of all the data has suggested that deeper levels of therapeutic hypothermia are better. In almost everybody agreed that some hypothermia is better than none. And so the authors were really wanted to emphasize that, and I wanted to share that part with you guys. Now, when you cool people, they shiver. And shivering leads to increased metabolic activity, and it makes it difficult to attain core body temperatures that are therapeutic. So there's a scale called the Bedside Shiver Assessment Scale, the BSAS. I don't know why we love using acronyms, but anyway. So BSAS. All right, a score of 0 is good on the BSAS scale. It means there's no shivering. A score of 1 is mild. The shivering is localized to the neck and thorax, may be seen only as an artifact on ECG or felt by palpation, right? You can kind of feel the hair standing up and on someone's skin, see the goosebumps, so to speak. On a score of 2 is moderate. There's intermittent involvement of the upper extremities, plus or minus the thorax. And then in severe shivering, there's generalized shivering or sustained upper and lower extremity shivering, right? So everything's just going like that. And everybody has had that experience of being in a cold place and experiencing these different levels of shivering. So this comes out of, it didn't record that. Sorry, this came out of a nursing journal, and was a really well-written article that was concise. And so they looked at, well, then how do we manage shivering? What's our anti-shivering protocol? Well, before even starting temperature management, you should be considering how to manage shivering. And you can give patients Tylenol, buspirone, and magnesium sulfate to prevent shivering from the get-go. And then when somebody has mild shivering, you begin counterwarming of the skin by using a bear hugger and setting the bear hugger at 43 degrees. And then giving them a dose of dexmedetomidine or fentanyl and providing some mild sedation. When they get to the severe shivering, so we're going to skip the next phase for a moment. When you get to somebody who's full body shivering, then it's having them on propofol with a paralytic on board, whether it's rocuronium or vecuronium, having them be in deep sedation with neuromuscular blockade so they can't actually physically move and shiver is the management for that. So this requires attention to that and recognizing the differences between somebody who's not shivering, somebody who's mildly shivering, where you may just see it subtly on the ECG and you may see that it looks like they have goosebumps, right? Versus those that are starting to show some shivering of their upper extremities and then full body shivering there. So, and the some shivering group gets dexmedetomidine and an opiate as well. So there's not as much of a difference. And this is in line with what our management strategies will be for our patients at this hospital. So we're going to give them Tylenol and buspirone, and then put a bear hugger on them at 43 degrees to initiate at the onset of any shivering. So stage 1, when we see that, we're going to do that. If that doesn't control the shivering, we're then going to give some magnesium sulfate, a 1 gram per hour IV, and then give them either dexmedetomidine or fentanyl or Demerol to assist with sedation. And if that doesn't control them, then we're going to propofol and a paralytic. So this published article here is pretty much what we're drawing from for our own management at Palomar. So next, any questions about that? Okay, cool. It's always, to me, just interesting when you're putting a bear hugger on somebody that you're trying to cool. Right, since that's a device that we're using to warm somebody when they are cool. But it's the idea of providing surface temperature management. So you're pressing on the gas and the brakes at the same time of this vehicle to get the right to find the right speed, so to speak. And so by controlling surface temperature is an important aspect to allow us to achieve core temperature. So it's important to see those two pieces. All right, so in resuscitation, we looked at improvement of consciousness before initiating target temperature management. So this is to provide, this is a voice for the skeptics, right? That, listen, some patients are going to have improvement in their consciousness before target temperature management, and some of them maybe don't need it because they're going to improve anyway. And so this study looked at 760 patients that were admitted to ICU after cardiac arrest. Of the 760, they had to exclude 220 of them because 164 of them died within 3 hours of post-arrest. So they're like, okay, well, let's throw that group out. And then they took out 57 because in 57 patients, they started target temperature management early. There was no delay. So they did it within their time frame, which was less than 3 hours. So again, put that into context when you're thinking about this, because you've seen the data on 90 minutes, and now we're taking this out to 3 hours, right? So we're at 180 minutes before they're considering starting temperature management. So of those 540, 180-minute, temperature management people, they looked at GCS, and they looked at the Glasgow Coma Scale for the motor function, right? So telling somebody to show me 2 fingers is more or less the questions that you ask, or some command of lift up your right hand or something of that nature. And if they follow your command, that's a score of 6. So 96 patients following this at 3 hours could raise their hand. And so they're showing you, like, listen, nearly 1/5 of the patients, almost 1 in 20 patients, are raising their hand at a question after 3 hours. And maybe 1 in 20 don't need therapeutic hyperthermia, therefore, because they're already neurologically recovering, and we just didn't give them enough time to watch them recover. And so perhaps they shouldn't have the effort of therapeutic hyperthermia applied to them. That's what the authors are going to come to. But the overwhelming majority at 3 hours aren't going to raise their hand, right? Let alone a finger. And so of that group, 86 out of this 444 are going to be discharged neurologically intact, right? So less than a quarter, so less than 25% are going to be leaving the hospital and neurologically intact. Whereas if you're able to do this within 3 hours, that's a pretty good sign, and 83 out of 96 are going to be able to do that. I didn't calculate the percentage, but it's going to be somewhere in the 80 to 85% rate, right? Well, it's going to be more than 83, we know that. So it's going to be somewhere in the 85 to 86% rate of intact survival. So early neurologic recovery predicts good neurologic outcome. That's kind of a no-brainer, no pun intended. This other group here, as a result of therapeutic hyperthermia, probably still improved 86, to 25%. But 25% of good neurologic outcome, in comparison to looking again at those neurons, that kind of correlates, right? Like, if we go back, this is why it's important. It's always important to keep the basic science in your mind. Not because it always predicts things perfectly, but just because it always gives you context, right? So here we're looking at, in this delayed group of 2 hours of hypothermia, getting you to about 20% of neuron retainment. And after 24 hours, you improved that to almost 50%. So it's not considering any other organs or any other effects. So 50% would be the expected mark at 90 minutes, and now we increased that delay by double. So we're probably going to be somewhere less than 50% for this group, just based on the basic science alone. So it shouldn't be that surprising that they only got to 25% in this group because of that. And it would have been nice if there would have been a separate report of this group to see what the percentage rate was for the 57 that they excluded for them. So the authors here show you a graph of what does it look like post-resuscitation and what their GCS is, right? So the lowest you can score on a GCS scale is 1 of any sub-piece, right? So 3 total, because it's eyes, verbal, and motor, but we're just looking at motor here, so the lowest score on this is 1. I know everybody else that does trauma is like, what the fuck did you just say? It's like, just the motor. All right, is 1. So overwhelming majority of patients are going to be at that level. They're initially more or less comatose, right? 3 hours post-ROSC, 311 of those patients that have survived are still at that level of 1, right? So that's what most people are at following an arrest, with a small percentage that are 2s, a small that are 3s, 4s, 5s, and there's this bump of survivors that are 6s within this 3-hour mark. When you look at the number of patients as well, and the change in GCS over time, you see that there's a large proportion that have a change of up to 5 point differences. So again, this is at 0 hours, 515 patients had a motor score of 1, while only 12% had a motor score between 5 and 6. At 3 hours, 125 patients had a motor score of 5 to 6. So an improvement to 23%, right? In this part B, the GCS changes between immediate ROSC to 3 hours shows that a total of 221 patients, or 41%, had changes in GCS score during the 3-hour interval, with improvement in 215 patients. So this whole total together is 215 patients that had some improvement. So overall, their conclusions were that a significant portion of patients had spontaneous neurologic recovery within 3 hours and had a favorable neurologic outcome, and therefore close monitoring of GCS and later initiation of TTM should be considered in those patients with a substantial likelihood of neurologic recovery. So the skeptic is going to love this article and just be like, see, told you we should just wait. Let's wait to see them wake up, and then if they don't wake up, then we'll start TTM.
Oops.
Right. So when I say that to you, you can also see that I have my own inherent bias is towards temperature management, but you also find out where you are on that scale, right? Like internally, you hear those numbers and you think like, okay, do I want to delay 3 hours or do I want to go faster? And that's where the debate is, and it's a good debate to have. These next articles will go through much faster. So this is an article on resuscitation, and I'm showing you mainly articles that were just recently published, so you can get the latest out there. Efficacy of cooling method for target temperature management in post-cardiac arrest patients. This was a systematic review and a meta-analysis, meaning they collected a whole bunch of papers together, looked at them to say, what are the different methods that are being used, and they compared endovascular cooling devices versus surface cooling devices, right? And what they found was they didn't see any difference in the outcomes of survival and improved neurologic status based on whether you used an endovascular device or you used a surface cooling devices. Both gave improvement, but the overall differences between the two were subtle and not statistically significant. I guarantee you everybody that has been doing research and focused on device development for intravascular cooling is gonna feel quite differently about this study, and they're going to be the skeptics. And and everybody that has put their dollars into Arctic Sun and other devices similar to that are cheering. They're going, great, the endovascular devices didn't beat us. Another article worth looking at here is looking at high-quality targeted temperature management after cardiac arrest. And so this was recognizing that it's a multidisciplinary approach to doing this, and that just saying that you're doing TTM isn't necessarily mean that you're doing it well. And I think that's always worthwhile, right? We talked about this before when we talked about doing EKGs. Just because you got a printout of an EKG didn't mean that you did the EKG right and that you did it well, and that the computer-aided algorithm that punched out was even correct. Because if the device wasn't played well, right, like think of it like a musical instrument, if you don't play an instrument well, nobody enjoys listening, right? If you don't manage people's temperature well, why should you expect benefit? Like you just, right? Like, so these authors are basically just pointing out that fact that, listen, there's a way of doing this well, and there's a way of not doing it well, and, let's give you some examples. So what are the different ways of doing this? You can cool people to 33 degrees. You can cool them to 36 degrees. You can do it for 24 hours, 48 hours, right? Most do this for at least 24 hours. You can use cold fluids to cool them, but we have seen various articles challenge whether or not cold fluids is beneficial or not. Does it help you get to the temperature you really want to get to, right? Pouring cold fluid into somebody will help you conceive that it should cool them, but it doesn't necessarily achieve the target temperature that you want to get just by doing that alone. That's like the idea that sometimes you're taking a big gallon of water and walking out in the ocean and pouring in the ocean thinking you're changing the level of the tide. And there are a lot of other features and factors that are going on for that temperature management, complex interactions between brain, kidney, heart, liver, other aspects that play important roles in chemical signaling. So here, cold fluids can be given, and then you could measure their temperature with a rectal probe, or you can use the endovascular probe, which is within the vessel, and having a core probe temperature there, or applying cold packs and just using ancillary probes, whether those are just putting a thermometer in somebody's mouth, or using a tympanic membrane monitor, or whatever else. Or you use blankets, right, which is really what kind of Arctic sun is surface cooling, and then using a gastric probe for measurement of core temperature. Or again, surface with the bladder probe, right? And this is, I would say, since that trial that was in the New England Journal, that most people have kind of gone to this management. 24 hours of cooling in a certain patient population, using a surface cooling device, and using a bladder probe with a Foley catheter. I keep forgetting what the sensor is called, but we almost always refer to it that way now.
Criticon?
Yeah. Right. So, but here are the different ways of cooling, right? And the authors are saying, listen, there's some ways that are better than others, and that high quality is early initiation, and that early initiation can be either intra-arrest with transnasal devices or other devices to cool the brain during this time, or after return of circulation and no cold fluids. The patient cooling can be active with slow rewarming, shivering management, strict and protecting against strict normothermia and adding sedation. The cooling phase can be through a core measurement and getting to a targeted temperature of either 33 or 36. Again, nobody's making a strong statement one way or the other which is better about this, unless you're an enthusiast, in which case you're a 33-degree guy, and if you're more skeptical, then you're 36, or none. And trying to drive that short time to target is what the authors are proposing as high quality. And again, the methods are important. So Group A here versus Group B. Group A is poor quality. There's no specific target temperature that you're using. You're using a peripheral temperature measurement with a thermometer.
Mm-hmm.
You're using ice packs or cold fluids. There's no shivering protocol. There's no specific fever control. And your monitoring is and treatment is a slow induction with high variability. And so therefore, and without any active rewarming protocols, right? So And this is what most communities had done initially when they were doing this. They were just like, okay, if you want me to cool somebody, fine, I'll cool them. But there was no thoughtful approach in interdisciplinary communication, right? Whereas a high quality one is one where you start off with a specific target, like we're going to drive these patients to this temperature. We're going to use surface or endovascular methods. We're going to have a shivering protocol in place to manage that. We're going to have something to prevent fever and have fever control measures in place. And we're going to have a temperature recording device that allows us to manage the temperature the entire way and their rewarming, and have a rewarming protocol specific for those patients, because you don't want to shoot past in temperature and stress a neuron that was just recently stressed by a noxic brain injury that you've just recovered and then now just exposed again to too much heat. And people know that. They do that with their plants all the time, right? If you need to bring a plant indoors to recover the plant, if you stick it back outdoors too soon, what happens? Plant dies. Mm-hmm. Right? So, same thing. I don't like using, anyway, it's not a good correlation to talk about brains and plants at the same time, because people already feel, already have their suspicions that we're trying to make them vegetables or whatever. Anyway, all right. With that being said, and kind of segueing to disparities, it's always important in any research study to look at, are there disparities? Do they exist? And in this is a editorial based on this article looking at racial and ethnic disparities in post-cardiac arrest targeted temperature management outcomes. What they found was whites versus non-whites. Then in non-whites, there was less application of temperature management. The patients didn't do as well with targeted temperature management versus whites. And that it's not all just explained by socioeconomic class. That the socioeconomic status isn't the only explanation for why whites do better with temperature management than non-whites do. And that there needs to be more attention explicitly paid to determining where our biases exist, where our biases exist within our own hospitals, and also where our biases exist institutionally, right? There's a number of hospitals that serve a higher proportion of non-white population, and are they as prepared and provided as much resources to provide targeted temperature management? Are they coordinating cardiovascular services as well, so on and so forth? And that's a complex problem. The authors of this editorial carefully describe that there's a pattern of seeing differences in racial disparities across a number of different resuscitation outcomes, not just in cardiac arrest, but this continues to persist even as our technology has improved. So despite technological advancements, there's still biases in healthcare that are creating inequality and injustice to those patient populations. And so it's worth at least mentioning here that should be a consideration. Any questions about that?
So they're saying demographics, based on demographics, that they're less likely to receive it, not that they're less likely to improve with it.
They're also less likely to improve with it. And so there's some consideration. So should we be studying why that was the case? Why is that population less likely to improve? And there are various arguments that are provided, and some better than others. Some of the issues are that patients who are already medically disenfranchised have higher comorbidities coming into it, right? So if you're coming into a cardiac arrest with more comorbidity, it's harder to recover you. And so the disparities for why those comorbidities exist is a whole other issue, right? So the differential rates of obesity in non-whites, the differential rates of atherosclerotic disease, and so on and so forth, all play a role within that, diabetes, and so on and so forth. The other aspect to that also is witnessed bystander CPR. There have been a number of articles that have shown racial disparities in bystander CPR, and that in whites and non-whites. Those are often further subjugated to studies of socioeconomic status. So in higher affluent areas, you're more likely to get bystander CPR than you are in less affluent areas, irrespective of of the racial disparity. But even with that consideration, there are non-white groups that are in high affluent areas that have less bystander CPR because culturally there's less often an approach to CPR in that population. So it still persists across socioeconomic status as well to some degree. So those disparities are at least worth keeping in mind and recognizing that they exist so that we can be mindful enough to collect data to continue to study that and determine what can we do operationally to improve that and understand it better.
Sad to say that it's still existing in this day and age.
Yeah, there was a study that I co-authored looking at the racial differences in out-of-hospital bystander CPR in Los Angeles, and the lead author on that was one of my colleagues, Peter Benson, and I did the analysis, I did the statistical analysis on the article, and then had to present it at some meetings. And what we found in LA County was that in Latino population, there was less pre-hospital bystander CPR because there was less desire for mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. And that was, at the time, the mode of pre-hospital CPR was mainly chest compressions, mouth-to-mouth, until that happened. And it just wasn't being adopted. And it wasn't being adopted for a number of reasons, because it wasn't being taught throughout different communities of LA, because the higher Latino population was generally in lower socioeconomic areas with higher population density, which created a greater difficulty of getting teaching out to those locations to change that. And we saw the same thing in African Americans, but to a lesser degree. And some of that may be that in Los Angeles County, the African American neighborhoods have had a longer establishment period. And so there has been more of a social infrastructure that's present.
Language barrier, I think, has a lot to do with it.
Well, language barriers too, yeah. Right. There's a whole slew of things, and that goes back to this idea of establishment within a geographic region, and the different social supports that's there, and we had to be careful about the way that we describe that because as a researcher, when you're describing a racial disparity, again, you have skeptics and enthusiasts on either side of that.
They got what they want.
Right. And you're trying to just say, listen, we're approaching this because we think it's important to look for disparities, and we're not trying to put blame on one group or another, and we're looking at this experience in Los Angeles and seeing how does this translate elsewhere. And we saw similar experiences in Arizona, and then we saw different experiences in Philadelphia, right? So the racial disparities that exist are so locally, and they do have to deal with these larger socioeconomic barriers that exist to education, cultural shifts in the mindset of the population, and saying, you can do something about this, which is why it's always a little bothersome to me when I have a physician who's like, that resuscitation research is bullshit because all those patients are dying anyway. Like, why are you guys bothering? It's like, we're supposed to have the attitude of how to do things better so that carries back out to the community that this is what we're doing. Like, the worst thing that can happen is for a community to sit there and look at a group of physicians who sit there and just go like, there's no use in doing that. Right? Like, that nihilistic attitude is it's certainly not beneficial. And I trust you. I mean, there are a number of people behind closed doors that will talk about, like, why do we even bother having an EMS system? And it's crazy, right, to think that. But there are a group of people out there that are just like, well, the amount of money that we pour into it with the outcomes that we get from it, they're very skeptical of that, and they'll voice this at like national meetings sometimes, and you're just like, where's this coming from? And they're just like, like some Asperger kid that's like just sitting there going like, I'm just looking at the numbers and this is, this is a waste of money. And you're just like, that's not the way that this approach is. Like, the approach is to improve the system, recognize the limitations, and continue to improve upon it. Not sit there and abandon the system when, in the old days, the issue was like, if you could catch a ride to the hospital, maybe you could get help. Right? Anyway. So, target temperature management in post-cardiac arrest patients. This is in academic emergency medicine, and this is like a condensed version of reviews that they've come up with. It's an evidence-based review that they call the brass tacks review. So it's like just getting to the punchline type of thing. And so they looked at a bunch of different studies and then just said, okay, is the number needed to treat good or not? And so they give it a color scale. So here they give it yellow, saying, well, it's like a yellow light. Like, you can thought, like, it's unclear. But that the overall summary heading is that targeted temperature management reduces mortality and improves neurologic outcome after cardiac arrest. They said that the benefits in the number needed to treat is that 1 in 19 patients were helped. So in every 19 patients that you apply this treatment to, 1 are going to be helped by this. That the benefits in percentages were 5.3% lower risk of death compared to not receiving this, and 5.5% lower risk of poor neurologic outcome in comparison to not receiving it. That there wasn't really a lot of harm in applying this, except for I'll tell you, some people will consider harm to be increased length of stay in hospital, increased ICU length of stay, which defers other ICU patients from getting to a bed, and death from any cause or poor neurologic outcomes was efficacy endpoints that were studied. And who was in the studies? They had 9 trials, 1,500 adult patients that were included in this study, in this review. So that's kind of their basic point of 1 in 19 patients are going to improve. It's going to be a modest improvement. There you go. And then you can consider, is it worth the time, energy, and expense to apply this? This was a recent study in critical care medicine that looked at the duration of target temperature management to the ischemic interval and good functional outcome. This is important to understand. The amount of downtime you have influences the amount of neuro injury that's occurred. It therefore may indicate that you should have a ratio of therapeutic hypothermia that's longer for the longer your downtime is. So the longer it takes you to get ROSC, the more neurons that have been injured, the longer you should resuscitate somebody with cooling the brain for that, right? So that's what the authors here were looking at. So the design here was a study of out-of-hospital cardiac arrest patients that were screened as part of this really large research consortium. So these names that are up here are some of the most influential researchers in the world, and at least in the U.S. in particular, that are part of this group called the Resuscitation Outcomes Consortium. They came from a group of hospitals that were carefully selected by National Institutes of Health. Some of them are in areas and or have resources that are far greater than most regular hospitals, so their generalizability is somewhat limited because of that. But as a group of researchers, these names are all very well respected in the field. And so most of these people are part of the liaison committee on resuscitation for American Heart Association and write the guidelines. And so, this is a multi-center study across the U.S. Adult non-traumatic out-of-hospital cardiac arrest patients screened for this, and this group was getting amiodarone, lidocaine, or placebo, and then looking to see if they survived hospital admission. And they received, as part of this drug trial, they also received targeted temperature management during this time frame. So this was in comatose survivors of out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. They defined hypothermia and ischemic ratio as a targeted temperature management, duration, time, divided by a calculated total ischemic time, which is approximately the time of arrest. So 911 call to medical services, to witness, to return to spontaneous circulation. That interval was the ischemic time interval. So they gave a calculated ratio between this and that. So the primary outcome was looking at hospital survival with good functional status, and they used a objective measure of that. They did a statistical model to control for a lot of different other factors, age, and other comorbidities. And between hypothermia ischemic ratio and the primary outcome, after adjusting for demographics, other arrest characteristics, VFib versus PEA arrest, so on and so forth, they had 3,400 patients that were eligible for the study. 36% were discharged with good neurologic outcomes, so that's a pretty decent number. You don't necessarily see that high of a number in most community hospitals, for instance. So it just gives you an idea again that you're coming from resource environments that have far more intense services available in collaboration, possibly. Patients had a mean age of 62 years, and the mean time to return of ROSC was 21 minutes. So again, this is a little on the earlier side in comparison to some other studies where the mean times may be much longer than 20 minutes. And the median duration of targeted temperature management was 32 hours. And a total of 2,500 had complete data and were included in the final analysis. And after adjustment for everything, a greater hypothermia to ischemic ratio was associated with increased survival with good functional outcome. So this conclusion is that you need to determine the duration of hypothermia based on what your ischemic time was, and have a more precise treatment algorithm than we're just going to put everybody on this for 24 hours. Right? Putting everybody on it for 24 hours is like a pill approach. If you buy a pill of acetaminophen, right, it's going to be 500 milligrams or 250 or whatever, or 325 or whatever, whichever one you're buying. But it's just going to be that tablet, and that's what you're going to give to every patient. And some patients are going to do better with it, some will not, right? So that pill approach, that non-specific approach to care is going to provide some benefits. And they're going further, they're saying, listen, if you pay attention to how long the patient was down and increase your hypothermia time in consideration of that, you'll get even better outcomes. So that's what the importance of this article was. This was a review of the management at 33 degrees versus 36 degrees. Looking at the retrospective cohort study, they found that in comatose adult cardiac arrest patients treated with management 33 degrees period had higher odds of neurologic intact survival to hospital discharge compared with those during targeted temperature management 36 degrees. Right. So this was a retrospective study that was done looking at a single center between 2010 and 2017, where they did this, and they showed improvement at 33 degrees versus 36, which was in opposition to the other study. But the other study was a prospective study, and a lot of people put more weight into a prospective study than they do a retrospective study because of the way the data is collected. So this is that article coming out of, this was a recent article that came out of New England Journal of Medicine looking at temperature management for cardiac arrest with non-shockable rhythms. It was a really important study because most of the studies up to this point started off with the patients that were most likely to survive, which were VFib arrests. VFib arrests, so the initial protocols for therapeutic hypothermia were a patient with ventricular fibrillation arrest, witnessed or unwitnessed, who had return of circulation within a certain time period, who was comatose. You cooled them, and then, right, that was the protocol. And we knew, like, the brain itself could care less what your rhythm was that was starving of oxygen, right? It's sort of like asking somebody when they're drowning in water, how deep is the water that you're drowning in? Who gives a fuck? You're drowning, right? It doesn't matter if it was 10 feet or an entire league, like. Right? So the brain itself is being starved of oxygen. does it really care if it was a VFib arrest or PEA arrest or asystole? No, right? And so here's an article that addresses that and says, listen, it's an anoxic brain injury, right? This management scheme is a neuroprotective management scheme for anoxic brain injury, period. And so amongst patients with coma who had been resuscitated with cardiac arrest with a non-shockable rhythm, meaning these were the non-VFib people, hypothermia at 33 degrees for 24 hours, so there's a pill approach, led to a higher percentage of patients who survived with a favorable neurologic outcome at 90 days than was observed with targeted normothermia, right? So letting nature take its course versus hypothermia, big difference. And this was for the group that had a non-shockable rhythm. So this is the data laying out there that we should be doing this irrespective of what the arrest rhythm was. The arrest rhythm has an important aspect to prediction of return of circulation, heart failure, and all the other comorbidities that exist, because certain arrest rhythms are more likely to be associated with other diseases like sepsis, right? If you go into cardiac arrest from septic shock, you're really hard to recover because you've got multi-organ failure and a bunch of other things happening. If you go into cardiogenic, or if you go into cardiac arrest because of hyperkalemia, right? You're not going to have a VFib arrest. But those patients may be easier to recover because it's just the electrolyte abnormality that you need to correct. There's some organ injury because of anoxic injury to the kidneys, to the brain, to the heart, but it was a single substrate that was contributing to that, and then you can, right? So there's a balance to this. So the reason why certain patients who don't have VFib can do better is because it was still an anoxic brain injury, and if we can recover them and we can intervene and make changes in their overall course based on the etiology, then we can make an improvement. And sometimes we can do that, and sometimes we're just up against the wall and there's no way to improve it.
But what you just said is towards the comorbidities, right?
Well, and towards the cause, the etiology, right? And that's the hardest part during cardiac arrest, is that the natural assumption is the patient's having cardiac arrest because of a thrombotic event that's occurred, right? That they have an occlusion of a coronary artery. That's an overwhelming approach that just clinicians and providers walk into the room. It's not the only reason that it happens. We have reminders of the H's and T's as reversible causes, but the amount of time that's spent during a cardiac arrest investigating those is poor. It's done, I'll say it's done poorly here, and I'll say it's done poorly many other places. The focus is reasonably on doing chest compressions and performing tasks, but one of the tasks that everybody does poorly is investigating why the arrest has occurred. So I would say that for most of the arrests when we don't recover somebody, we still don't know why we didn't recover them. We don't know what the cause was. We assume that it was due to myocardial infarction. But often when you actually study this and look at it, there's a lot that are due to electrolyte abnormalities. There's a lot that are due to sepsis. There are a lot that are due to other causes than that. And it really requires more effort to be paid to collecting diagnostic information as you're going along. And it's hard to do. You know, it's hard to stop and they're like, let's do a chest x-ray. Well, you're not going to do that until you get a pulse back. But the cause of why that's going down, right, like you have to sit there and have a suspicion, like I think this person's attention to pneumothorax, I'm going to push a chest tube in them for this. Or I really think, look at this person's appearance and and I got an I-stat and I can see that their creatinine is high and their K is right. But you have to be actively going after an I-stat every patient, and I promise you, if you look at our cardiac arrests that come to the ER, there's a fraction that have I-stats on them, and there's a large group that don't. And then especially now, I-stats aren't working. But anyway, whole other thing. All right. So, any questions about this non-shockable thing? Because that's kind of a newer. This is something a lot of us had thought about for a while, but this is at least data that had come out to support that and showing that. Therapeutic hypothermia after in-hospital cardiac arrest in children. What about doing this in kids? And the data has shown so far that amongst comatose children, who survived arrest at therapeutic hypothermia as compared with normothermia didn't, so that this is hypothermia versus just letting nature take its course, that didn't confer a significant benefit in survival of functional outcome at 1 year. So this is an argument for the skeptics who are like, listen, this doesn't work with kids, so we don't need to do this at a children's hospital, and so on and so forth. My initial experience in doing emergency care research was in pediatric cardiac arrest. That's what got me hooked into emergency medicine. It was a study by Dr. Gaushi Hill out of Harvard UCLA, who's just an incredible person, incredible researcher, academic, just general nice person as well. And she did a study looking at pre-hospital pediatric intubation and teaching medics in LA County. The conclusion was that they shouldn't be taught how to do pre-hospital pediatric intubations because it was really difficult to maintain the skill set to do that, and the outcomes weren't any better by doing that, and potentially led to certain delays in transfer to the hospital where potentially some of those kids could have received faster intubation and so on and so forth. It's going to be interesting to see that later on now, and hopefully in the future when we have video laryngoscopy available to medics and can actually see when we're intubating somebody and provide them that type of support. I'm hoping that that will be soon, and we can revisit that idea because as technology improves.
I think it's a cost issue more than that.
Yeah, so it's a cost issue, like for certain. And I don't want to be, I don't want to be ignorant of that, but it's only a cost issue because the Medical Legal Forum has spared the EMS culture. And the second somebody gets clever about that and realizes that there's an opportunity to look at delays and apply the delay, not the delay in diagnosis, but the delay in treatment arm to that, then suddenly one case pays for all of those for an entire county. So I think, in my mindset, there's a cost avoidance that should drive the delivery of video laryngoscopy that's mobile to our medics. But that's my own personal approach and does not reflect Palomar's opinion or anyone else's opinion. I want to be clear about that. But just if I was in charge. Anyway, targeted temperature management at 33 degrees versus 36 after cardiac arrest. So this is the big New England Journal article. It came out in 2013 and showed that in unconscious survivors, hypothermia as a targeted temperature at 33 didn't confer any benefit in comparison to 36. Again, this wasn't 33 degrees versus nothing, or 36 versus nothing. It's 33 versus 36. So both groups are getting hypothermia, and they felt that they showed that there was no statistical difference, and this is what changed everyone's opinion. This single article of 900 patients had a huge influence. It was a well-conducted study, and I don't have a lot of arguments against the authors. There are aspects about how long it took them to get there, whether or not they controlled for the ratio of this because they were just giving a pill approach of giving 24 hours of cooling. So this article I brought out because, one, it comes from a good journal from Lancet, and two, I really like the approach that the authors present here, which is looking at a comprehensive treatment plan for patients in hospital strategies. And that basically out-of-hospital cardiac arrest has improved in the past few decades because of improvements in the way that we're performing CPR. But still about half the patients who have this with VTAC or ventricular fibrillation who are admitted to the hospital will survive to discharge, with half of them not. And so in this paper, they kind of discuss, well, what are the best management strategies for the post-cardiac arrest syndrome, and what can we do to improve this, and that this is not just a matter of just cooling, but this is cooling, coordinating with the cath lab as to who should we be doing procedures on, even if there's no STEMI seen, and how can this improve prognosis? And so they look at the data, and you can see there's, you know, the 30-day survival rate is favorable in patients who have a shockable arrest rhythm with bystander CPR. You're looking at 65 to around 65% survival, if that's the case. And then if you have a shockable arrest without bystander CPR, that drops to the 50s. If you have a non-shockable arrest rhythm, so your PA or asystole with bystander CPR, the survival rate is 10%. And if you're a non-shockable arrest without bystander CPR, there's like more or less around 10%, slightly higher. And,
That's odd.
right. So there, again, when you're looking at some of these studies, you're realizing there's something about the group that's non-shockable where it's difficult to predict what the improvements are, because some of those improvements have a different rate of those patients that have a single substrate that's missing versus those that have multiple substrates that are missing. And so you get these variable responses where sometimes it looks like, well, so it's better not to perform CPR on the patient by the bystander until they arrived? And it's a different scenario. So it's always worthwhile to separate in the analyses, recognizing who has shockable versus non-shockable rhythms, as you can see here, like the different outcomes in those groups. But it even requires further subdividing within that group to figure this out. This looks at causes, right, of witness out-of-hospital arrest in adults. I didn't look into the fine details of how they determine these causes, because I've done this myself at Palomar, and it's far more complex than I ever thought it was going to be, and far more surprising to me than I thought it was going to be. The number of cardiac arrests that I've seen here that are not due to cardiac cause has been impressive. And so here you can see in panel A, this is witness of EMS responders or bystanders who had return of spontaneous circulation before arrival, and those who survived with favorable neurologic outcome at 30 days after cardiac arrest. So that's what panel A and panel B are. And overwhelming the majority of those that survive are those with a cardiac cause, because we're all set up to manage that patient, right? We're all thinking that already, and we're managed for it, so we do better with those patients. Those that are due to an external cause, less so. Due to respiratory failure, less so. Due to CVA, less so. And due to others, considerably less so. And that's seen throughout. Their algorithmic approach here is listed as an algorithm for care for out-of-hospital cardiac arrest due to shockable rhythm. But the very next line is the algorithm may also be applicable to selected patients with out-of-hospital rhythms who have non-shockable rhythms as well. So you can apply it to both groups, especially given that other study that had recently come out. So patient with out-of-hospital cardiac arrest comes to the hospital. They get the routine ACLS, ECG. Here they use transthoracic echo, which I always think is an important part of the resuscitation technique, and doing a targeted temperature management initiation, considering reversible causes, the H's and the T's. Our code blue sheets have the H's and T's listed on them. They have on the paper, it tells the person recording, interrupt the resuscitation within 5 minutes and discuss the H's and T's with the entire team. Doesn't mean stop. Doesn't say stop right. Interrupt to explicitly discuss them. To my chagrin and frustration, this is what they record the arrest on. That's a blank piece of paper. I don't know how to beg, borrow, steal away a way to influence everybody to please use the sheets. Use the code blue sheets, because they tell you what to do, and you help introduce that thought so that the physician who may be intubating in that early period may be task-oriented and not considering the differential diagnosis as much. Or the team, more importantly, it really doesn't come to the physician. The team isn't considering that. So once the team discusses what the potential reversible causes are, the team will make an approach appropriate for that. And too often what happens is you're 15, 20, 25 minutes into this thing, and someone's like, well, it could have been thrombosis. And everyone's like, well, fuck, I don't think it's worth giving the thrombolytic now. We've already been at this for 25 minutes. And the natural question that comes up, like the second that comes up, the natural question is, well, what was the downtime before they got here? Right? There's already the calculation of, is this worthwhile to do now? If in the first 3 minutes we get everybody talking about it, then we can make decisions about, is this appropriate, is it not appropriate, right? And then it doesn't really mean you're going to do it, but at least as a team, you're approaching it, you can walk out of that resuscitation going like, we did a kick-ass job. Anyway, so if there's some way of doing that, it would be wonderful. So if there's no ROSC, then consider ECMO. It's not, I didn't write the article, but I've just been saying it for 4 years. If there is ROSC, is this a STEMI ROSC, right? Or did you have, or was there a shock? If so, then go to the cath lab and perform PCI. If there's return of circulation and it's stable and there's no STEMI, then consider brain CT for further diagnostics, including coronary angiography, plus or minus going to the cath lab. Admit to the intensive care unit. This part here, the plus or minus PCI, is asterisk because there's a part that we'll come back to in a moment. But admit to intensive care unit, routine intensive care management with optimized ventilation, circulation, renal function, electrolytes, blood glucose, etc. Targeted temperature management for 24 hours and rewarming, right? I think if authors had to rewrite this again, maybe they would include ratio management. Diagnose and treat seizures, wean sedation, and attempt to wake patient at normothermia. And it continues, if the patient doesn't awake, then delay the prognosis for at least 72 hours. It's a really important aspect to this. There are a number of patients who will have almost no brainstem activity that's recognizable, like you'd go to check a corneal reflex, it's not there, so on and so forth, who have intact neurologic recovery. So the neuroprediction within the first 24 hours, it's been studied over and over again. There's no specific combination of things you can do that predict what the neurologic recovery will be in the first 24 hours. You can't predict it. So the delay in prognosis should occur 72 hours after rest, not within the first 24 hours. And there's debate if within the first 72 hours there's any benefit to doing it as well. Consider, that doesn't mean that they don't require careful neurointensive evaluations, but the prognosis that's conveyed to the family should be delayed because the data isn't there to support using it. Pupillary and corneal reflex is absent, bilaterally absent, N20s or SPEPs, or both, so you're not seeing evoked potentials from the brain and a bunch of other things after 72 hours after rest. If that's all a no, then reassess after 24 hours for 2 or more of the following. Either status myoclonus or high neuron-specific enolase concentration. If all that's a no, observe and reassess with multiple methods, including MRI. If this is a yes, meaning there's absence of corneal reflex and there's no evoked potentials, then consider stopping treatment. Right, so at the 3-day mark, you're pretty much like, listen, if we haven't recovered you and you're not showing brainstem reflexes, like, we should consider stopping. If you still have these reflexes in place, but there's status myoclonus that's occurring, or you have these high enolase concentrations indicating a lot of brain damage, and a malignant EEG, then you should consider stopping, because this group isn't going to do well. So, right. And if you're no to all of these, then you have to keep kind of going down the line saying, what can we do to try to resuscitate this person still? We're still in the resuscitation phase.
This is after 3 days?
Yeah. If the patient wakes up and intact, then it's just routine treatment, coronary angiography plus or minus PCI. So there may be delayed cath for those patients. So that's one approach. And this is what they're suggesting is like right. This requires coordination between ER, ICU, cardiology, and cardiothoracic surgery for ECMO if you have it. This is the guidance on immediate coronary angiogram following resuscitation. So this is that asterisk taken out. So ROSC has returned, but the patient remains comatose. If they have the presence of multiple adverse features, meaning it's an unwitnessed arrest, the initial rhythm wasn't VTAC or VFib, there's no bystander CPR, greater than 30 minutes to attain ROSC, there's still ongoing CPR, regional cerebral oxygen saturations are less than this. You only get this if you have a monitor in place for it, but you don't have to. pH less than 7.2, so severely acidotic, plasma lactate concentration greater than 7, ammonia concentrations that are high, over 85 years of age, end-stage renal disease, non-cardiac cause for the arrest. If you're yes to those, you're unlikely to benefit from coronary intervention, and we probably shouldn't be requesting our cardiologist to take those patients to the lab. But if you're no to these, you were witness arrest, you were in VTAC, or your ROSC time was less than 30 minutes, so on and so forth, the ECG, if there's ST segment elevation, then it's pretty easy. You go to the cath lab. If there's not ST elevation, then there's still a consultation with cardiology to consider if it's appropriate to do this, because there are a number of patients who don't show ST elevation because the heart's been injured enough that the whole electrical axis is diminished. The amplitudes are all diminished, and so you may not see the STEMI criteria being met, though they have an acute occlusion. It's tricky. So. And then this didn't come out as well. I'm sorry. This is one of our proposed algorithms that we're going to be reviewing later today in the Code Blue meeting. But basically, the approach, I'll read this off because it's just hard to see here, is if ROSC is attained in the field, you call RRT when the patient arrives, and they'll bring an Arctic Sun down if the patient's comatose and we'll begin cooling the patient. So if ROSC is obtained in the ED, same thing. Notify RRT. They're already notified generally, I think, with that. And they'll so RRT is going to be the group bringing the device down. The ER physician will consider cooling within this time frame. Consultation is going to also be stressed to occur early with ICU so that we can coordinate our management decisions. The intensivists are going to be concerned about not cooling patients who have head bleeds. So there's going to be we're going to need to consider these patients as treating them like trauma patients and stroke patients that come in, that they should get prioritized for head CT following this. We probably should have already been doing that, we just haven't. So I'm glad we're going through this exercise because hopefully this will improve our post-resuscitative care anyway. And then the idea is to look at the core temperature. If the core temperature is greater than 91.4, then remove ice and consider room temperature saline. Here the recommendation was to use cold saline. I'm not a big fan of using cold saline. I'd rather use an ice pack until we get patients on a device because those are easy to remove. It's hard to remove cold saline. You could do it, but people get all upset when you phlebotomize. And then if the temperature remains high, then and they meet inclusion criteria after a discussion with the intensivist as well, then put the pads on. And the pads that are out now with this new Arctic Sun are a gel pad. They're not a water pad. And they don't cover your entire body. They only cover like 30% of the surface, but they cool enough to manage your core temperature. So that's the new thing with the new device. And because the hospital bought a new device, we all need to figure out how to do it. There'll be obviously more formal education on the management of that, but worthwhile to mention this is what they look like, and they're just a pad. And they just get affixed to it, and there's no water circulating through them. So the good thing is there's less mess, sort of. And these are safe to stay on during cath and everything else as well. So that's some of the new features to this. The goal here is to consider early cooling, and there's some studies out there suggesting that if you can get cooling within 30 minutes, that there's better outcomes. That data may reflect a very robust collaboration between the groups we mentioned before, and so the outcomes might be better because there's just better coordination. It may not be completely attributable to the cooling, but the biologic data suggests the earlier you get the cooling, the better the patients do. So 30 minutes is a reasonable time if you can obtain the rule out of the head bleed within that time frame too. Stabilizing the patient, and then if the rest was witnessed, and if the patient, if it was witnessed, and if there is opportunity for cardiac cath lab, then you have that discussion and get them to the lab. If not, they're admitted to ICU. So, any questions about that type of algorithm? It's pretty simple. So, there you have it. That's our introduction to the target temperature management, the rationale behind it, why it may be beneficial, who it would be beneficial in, and the issues of how to manage not only that, but how to manage the shivering. And then there's a whole other phase to this on the post side for ICU people of, well, how do you rewarm somebody? And over what period of time? That's when it's going to matter. For us, it's going to be simple. Put it on, cool them, and then they magically go away, and we're ready for the next patient that needs it. So thank you all for your attention. If there's any questions, I'm happy to go over those too.
So they can send somebody upstairs with the Arctic cooling on to the cath lab?
Yes.
They get started and still go to the cath lab?
Yeah.
Sometimes they don't wait, they wait till after.
Yeah, why is that?
This is why we need to coordinate. Right? Left hand, right hand. That's how we do it.
Right, left
Right.
hand?
Yep.
Thank you.
I'll be back.